In the darkened folds of a December evening, where the fog licked the cobblestones like a sleepy cat, and lantern glow painted the brick walls amber. A small town with a name too long and Welsh to remember properly decided, without fanfare, to put on its coziest winter pajamas and prepare for Christmas. This was the kind of old country town where the wind didn't blow, it politely suggested, where the bakery's window was always fogged up with warmth and secrets, and where the postmaster wore exactly the same knitted scarf every year, ever since King Edward VII had a moustache that twitched like a mouse under moonlight. It smelled of coal smoke and warm bread, and if you pressed your ear to the frost-kissed window panes of any cottage, you could hear the ticking of the long-case clocks, tall, proud, and slightly judgmental, measuring out time in a way that felt less like seconds and more like teaspoons of molasses. This was a place where the milk froze in the bottle on the doorstep, thick with cream like a sleepy dream, and where no one minded, because the cream made the tea taste like velvet dipped in nostalgia. It was December after all, and nothing moved quickly in December, not the sheep in the fields still wearing their woolly coats with smug confidence, and certainly not the trains, whose timetables were more of a polite suggestion than an operational principle. Now, imagine being a small child in this town, possibly with a mitten that never stayed put and a button always halfway off. A child with a red nose, a rattling cough that sounded worse than it was, though his aunt swore it was consumption or coming very close, and a mostly healthy disregard for socks. This child, you perhaps, in the story's corner now, knew that Christmas in this old town was not just a holiday, but a full sensory opera of crackling fires, clove-stuck oranges, and a baffling assortment of relatives who all smelled faintly of lavender and mothballs, and seemed to believe that the best gifts were hand-knitted and required no receipt. The town's preparations had begun not with declarations or parades, but with the solemn hanging of the pudding cloths, like ancient battle flags hoisted in victorious anticipation of a well-boiled dessert. These cloths, round and sagging like sleepy moons, dangled from kitchen beams, swinging gently as if dreaming of the feast to come. In the general store, where everything cost a halfpenny or a suspiciously vague amount of barter in eggs, tinsel had been strung across the shelves in a way that suggested both celebration and mild confusion. A solitary peppermint stick leaned languidly between two dusty jars of pickled onions, like a festive mistake that no one corrected. The proprietor, Mr. Morgan, a man with a moustache like folded laundry, had already begun muttering about shortages, though it was unclear whether he meant cloves, crackers, or his own patience. Meanwhile, on the high street, women bustled in capes that billowed like ships at harbour, clutching baskets full of things that couldn't possibly all be needed but were bought anyway, because it's the holidays, Edith, heavens above. Where are your walnuts? Above their heads, the rooftops wore snow like an old-fashioned wig. Dignified, slightly absurd, but perfect for the season. Occasionally, a rosy-cheeked boy would slide past on a sled that looked like it had once been a cupboard door, shrieking with the joy of someone who didn't yet have to worry about tailbone bruising. Inside, the cottages were already beginning to smell like bedtime. Cinnamon, pipe smoke, and the slow, sleepy stew of vegetables that had names you couldn't spell, but tasted like your grandmother's kitchen felt at dusk. Fires crackled in hearths too tiny for modern notions, their flames making shadows dance softly across wallpaper that had seen more birthdays than most. And somewhere, in the back parlour of a cottage off Goose Hill Lane, a street not primarily for geese, but traditionally understood to have hosted several dodgy poultry deals. A child listened to the tick of that long case clock, inhaling the piney scent of the tree in the corner, its homemade paper stars drooping with pride. Already the house had been visited by an elderly caroller who came too early and sang too long, like a ghost who forgot his lines but showed up anyway. And there were whispers from cousins arriving on the 7 o'clock train, bundled in scarves, asleep on one another's shoulders, with parcels tied in brown paper and dreams of puddings thicker than gravity. If these stories helps you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now close your eyes as the snow begins to fall again outside, and listen. Can you hear the church bell in the distance? It's telling us something, ever so gently, down the cobbled main street of the town, just wide enough for one cart, 2 dogs, and a scandal if someone hung their stockings before December, leaned the post office. Not the sort of post office with efficient rows of pigeonholes and a festive stamp selection, but the sort of post office where time took a nap in the back room, and the mailman's name was obviously Bert, because what else would it be? You could tell it was Christmas time there, even if no one said so aloud, partly due to the mild yet courageous attempt at decorations, which involved 3 paper garlands and 1 boldly threadbare sprig of holly over the ledger. But mostly, you could sense it from the smell. Parcels wrapped in brown twine and long journeys, perfume letters from cousins, and the sort of candle wax that thinks it's doing a better job than it is. Old towns have a peculiar way of hoarding Christmas, like squirrels with short-term memory loss. They stash little bits of it behind every shop window, in every sooty fireplace that hasn't been cleaned since the last century, when Queen Victoria was still grumbling about drafty corridors. Everyone complains a little about the cold, but secretly enjoys it, because it's tradition to grumble, and tradition is very warm once you get used to it. On this particular December morning, the frost had shown up with a bit more theatrical flair than usual. Every lamppost wore a lace of ice, and even the grumpiest of widowers, one Mr. Higrove by name and nature, paused before growling about it, which was as good as a sonnet in this town. The old clock tower, which had been accurately wrong for 26 years, chose this exact day to work again. It startled the birds, the baker's apprentice, and one gentleman of uncertain age who had just tied his coat to a bench for reasons unclear. "Well," said Mrs. Tiptree, from behind her lace curtains, "if the clock's gone sensible, we can expect snow, or scandal." And indeed, a scandal of sorts did arrive. It came not in the form of fire or feud, but in post and promise. A letter sealed in green wax, perfumed faintly of peppermints and some little-known French biscuit. It was addressed to Master James, aged 8 3/4, upstairs room with a fireplace that rattles, the Bluebell Inn. This was remarkable for several reasons, not least of which was that it arrived on a Wednesday, which traditionally refused to deliver anything more than gas bills and lost gloves. James, yes, the James in question, was an authority on important Christmas matters. At 8 3/4, one becomes rather adept at estimating the probability of snowfall based on the way toast burns, and at calculating how many carols must be sung before someone gifts you a coin, or better, a boiled sweet. His opinion on Christmas was sought often and respected even by the lamplighter, who was notoriously difficult to please unless offered mince pies in quantities that made physicians nervous. When the letter thudded onto the wooden counter, Mr. Burt of the post office stared at it as if it might offer him a raise. Foreign, he declared to no one, which is how statements were generally made. Foreign post. That meant one thing in an old town like this. Someone's cousin had married oddly and now lived abroad, or the king of somewhere small was writing again, mistaking the Bluebell Inn for a diplomatic address. Other possibilities existed, of course, but those were the ones everyone hoped for. The envelope itself was curious, thick like marmalade spread on proper bread, crinkled at the corners as though it had travelled by camel, or at least through Leeds. The wax had a stamp in the shape of a goose, and this too was debated over by the town's senior gossip circle, unofficial but highly efficient, who concluded that either it was a mistake or a new European custom, possibly festive. James would not open it, not right away. That would be improper. One had to examine it first, shake it gently for echoes of magic or relatives, and then hold it to the light, preferably while making thoughtful noises. Only once one had done the whole ceremonial sequence, ideally while sipping hot milk and sitting on the windowsill, could a letter like that be opened. And there, under the cold window pane fogged by breath and the dreams of sugar plums long since outlawed by dentists, James sat, examining the mysterious envelope. Outside, the snow began to consider its options, and somewhere, beyond the curve of the frosted hills, something caught the wind's attention. But that is another memory, for another pause in the evening. The frost, it seemed, had opinions that morning, or at the very least, an artistic sensibility. Our windows weren't merely iced over. They were masterpieces of delicate fern fronds and swirling sigils that looked remarkably like the Queen's cursive signature from a distance, or so said Uncle Basil, who had worked as the assistant night porter at the town's reading room for a 4-day stretch in '88 and fancied himself a connoisseur of squiggles and statecraft alike. Inside our cottage, woolen socks sizzled slightly by the fire, drying from the previous day's sledding misadventures, while the ticking of the tall case clock in the hallway kept slower, more contemplative time. It always gained a peculiar dignity this time of year, as if deeply aware that Christmas was coming and wanted to be on its best behaviour. In a brighter corner of the sitting room, Grandmama was installing herself in her slipper chair for the ceremonial reading of the post. Each morning she opened the Christmas cards with seriousness akin to a bishop deciphering ancient scrolls. "Oh, look," she murmured, squinting through her pince-nez. "The Barrowcloths have sent a card with a robin perched on a spade. How terribly allegorical." She passed it to Cousin Elsie, who was already building a small citadel out of discarded envelopes and bits of sealing wax. These would later house imaginary nobles engaged in sugar sack diplomacy, often involving marzipan bribes and lime jelly embargoes. Outside, the wide street of the village was still quiet, though the scent of coal smoke and sugared buns drifted in through the cracks of our sash windows with the persistence of a gossip. That was Mrs. Biddle, surely, her bakery's chimney puffing out its daily announcement that today was indeed a good morning to be alive, provided one had teeth sharp enough for her ginger snaps. They were, in her defense, only gently weaponized. Our dog, Thimble, had already coat-checked himself somewhere inside the folds of the hearth rug and was producing a series of operatic snores that rhymed peculiarly with the kettle's wheezing. Some mornings, it was as though the house itself was composing a symphony of domestic contentment, with a slight undertone of impending kettled mischief. Breakfast, when it came, was the clink of spoons and the low mumbled chant of butter negotiations. "You've slathered the lion's share," muttered Great-aunt Allworthy, eyes narrowing at Cousin Peter, who had, admittedly, taken an approach to toast, not unlike a thatcher that uses butter for his roof work. The toast was slightly burnt, not chaotically so, but in that exact 19th century way that implied it had been toasted with a fork over an open flame, while someone got distracted telling a ghost story about a haunted plough. The sort of toast you forgive because it pairs well with thick marmalade and warmer memories. After we finished eating, bundled up in scarves that felt older than democracy, we prepared for our morning walk to the village green, an act of social observation parading as exercise. Now, the green was not particularly green this time of year, being under a respectful inch of crusty snow. But the vendors were already beginning to set out their Christmas fare beneath festively sagging bunting. You had your traditional stalls, candied apples from red-cheeked apple men, cinnamon nuts rattling in iron pans, and the strange sort of mild chaos that always accompanied Mr. Picton and his guaranteed unpredictable marionettes. This being an old country town, the marionettes occasionally broke into hymns, mutinied, or declared short-lived but deeply felt republics. Everything smelled gloriously of nutmeg, wool, horse, and the sharp tang of oranges, those rare, glowing citrus orbs that had begun to appear in crates on account of the holiday. The arrival of oranges was always regarded like the coming of minor royalty. We weren't entirely sure where they came from, only that they involved ships, sailors, and the occasional amphora, which was thought to be a kind of spicy vase. We paused before Mr. Bramblehurst's general store, whose windows were frosted over with all the invention of a Dickensian stage production. He had arranged a modest but proud display of tinsel, licorice pipes, and tin trains that ran in an eternal, slightly wobbly loop beneath an evergreen branch suspended by improbable string theory. And there, in the murmuring rhythm of our breath against the winter air, we knew the season had properly begun. Not with fireworks or feasts, but with wool mittens clutching hot chestnuts, and our shadows lengthening toward the snowbanks like curious spectres. It was Christmas in the old country town, and everything was slowly, wonderfully, coming alive. But not too alive, of course. After all, there were still cookies to burn, choir rehearsals to sabotage, and one very elderly goose to catch before sundown. If anyone could remember where on earth she'd gone, in that curiously magical slowness between St. Nicholas Day and Christmas Eve, where each twilight arrived like a candle being lowered into warm molasses, the town settled further into its woolen hush. Snow had begun its daily shift of murmuring, descent, arriving not with blasts of grandeur but dainty, drifting negotiations, each flake floating down as if apologizing for the inconvenience. At the edge of the village, past the crooked fence where hens thought themselves philosophers, and the barn had developed distinct opinions about Protestant hymnals, stood the Chandler's cottage. Here lived old Mr. Wiggins, who made candles by day and snuck illicit currant buns by night. Mr. Wiggins had a beard like frosted cauliflower and wore the same argyle scarf for so many winters that it had started applying for property rights. His shop, attached to the cottage by what one might generously call architectural optimism, was a haven for children and moths alike. Shelves brimmed with tapers, church candles, household cylinders, and beeswax blocks stacked like sleepy yellow dominoes. Historians would perhaps scoff at a candle shop being a hub of Christmas culture, but that's only because none of them ever tried slipping on a recently waxed pine floor wearing woolen socks and too much enthusiasm. Every year, around this time, Mr. Wiggins boiled fir essence into his wax, for seasonal conviction, he said, The result was a candle that smelled exactly like the forest on a foggy December morning. Dignified, a bit suspicious, and overwhelmingly piney. Children would scamper in to watch the dipping process, the rhythmic lowering of wicks into pots of melted wax, breathing in that ghostly sweetness while slowly getting high on warm nutmeg fumes wafting from the neighbour's kitchen across the lane. It is at this point we must issue a soft historical clarification. Victorian children weren't constantly solemn and dressed like overachieving chimney sweeps. They laughed, plotted mischief, and invented entirely pointless winter games with names like Stick and Holler or Wintry Button. And they adored visiting adults like Mr. Wiggins, those semi-official town peculiarities whose professions blurred charmingly with eccentric behaviour. One particular December Tuesday, Wiggins introduced a new candle size, festively stubby. No one knew why he called them that, since they were neither festively shaped nor particularly stubby by modern standards. But marketing begins in the heart, not the product. He tied red string around each one and offered them in bundles of 4, declaring solemnly, "They burn at precisely the mood of a Christmas Eve wish, overly hopeful with a tendency to flicker." Down the road, Farmer Blibbs, who moonlighted as the town council's most reluctant treasurer, grumbled about all this nonsense candle commerce, but even he bought 2 bundles, claiming it was for practical lighting, while clearly sniffing every waxy bouquet with startling tenderness. Flickering little torches were now cropping up behind every crisscrossed window pane. At dinner time, families would strike long matches, the ones that sounded like tiny violins when lit, and lean in as their rooms filled with a honeyed luminosity. Shadows grew cozier, fires seemed to purr, and Grandma Tildy declared for the 3rd year running that candlelight made her carrots taste more expensive. In the churches too, candles were being prepared for the lessons and carol service. Here, history meets liturgy for a yearly tryst, and no one dares speak its awkwardness aloud. Wax had to be measured, wicks trimmed, and small paper discs, drip guards indicating centuries of religious pragmatism, punched out with great ceremony. These little shields were the unsung heroes of Christmas, preventing hymnals from becoming dotted with molten hieroglyphs and elderly sopranos from unwelcome surprises. And still, the snow fell. Slow, sugar-glazed flakes turning the chimneys into frosted chess pieces and coating the town roofs like a baker's idle hand. From attic windows, children pressed sleepy noses to the cold glass and watched candle glow from neighbouring homes swirl with snowfall into golden fuzz shapes, storybook dreams softened by drooping eyelids. In that flickering warmth, amid laughter muffled by mittens and the faint clink of molasses spoon teacups, the candle season was alive. No urgent shopping, no blaring tunes about bells needing someone to rock them. Just the hush of flickering flame, scented wax, and community lit gently from within. Outside the Wiggins shop, a boy named Alfie stood holding a candle stub and watching as his breath mixed with the amber mist of the lantern above. He wasn't quite sure if it was the candles or the snow or something else that made the whole world feel brushed with velvet. An owl called once from the wood's edge, and in the distance, someone began to pull out a fiddle. It only meant one thing. It was nearly time for the wassailers to begin their rounds. But that, of course, is a sleepy echo for another hour. The old bakery on the corner of Weft and Barrel Street smelled like cinnamon promises and treacle second chances. It had stood there longer than most of the town's residents could remember, slouching slightly to one side like it had grown tired of being so delicious all the time. Its timber beams were buttery with age, and each pane of glass in the front window wobbled slightly, like it wasn't quite sure where it belonged. On a December morning, when the fog still clung to the rooftops like a damp shawl, the bakery's chimney would puff out gentle clouds of spice, waking the town more effectively than church bells or civic responsibility ever could. Inside, Mrs. Tittleman reigned supreme, a woman who could make a scone so flaky it needed therapy. She wore her apron like a queen wore a ceremonial robe, only hers was dusted with flour and raisins instead of embroidery, and the tears of 1,000 unpaid servants. There was no telling precisely how Mrs. Tittleman's family had acquired the bakery, but rumours abounded. Some said her great-grandmother won it in a pudding duel, an old form of conflict resolution that was largely ignored by Parliament, but still legally binding within certain yeast-based guilds. Others claimed the bakery had always been there, and that Mrs. Tittleman simply hatched from a croissant one Easter morning and never left. Whatever the origin, it was accepted that she knew pastry like birds knew sky. During the week before Christmas, the bakery became the pulsing, sugary heart of the town. Every child, whether officially small or simply small at heart, gathered at the frost-glazed windows to watch the trays of golden treats emerge from the ovens like a sugary cavalry. There were ginger snaps so crisp they could file your taxes, and mince pies so overfilled they frequently spilled secrets. And of course plum pudding, that ancient seasonal oddity which, strictly speaking, contained more imagination than plums. Nobody in town actually liked plum pudding very much, but they were enthusiastic about having it. Tradition is like that, stubborn and politely unappetizing. The puddings were made weeks in advance, stored in linen wraps, and steamed again for hours, as if the dessert itself needed time to rethink its choices. Often, a sixpence was hidden inside, allegedly for luck, though it's unclear how being nearly choked by pocket change betters your odds. Young Thistlewick, whose real first name was Horace, but everyone agreed that sounded too parliamentarian for a boy with jam always behind his ears, was particularly entranced by the tray of jumbles cooling on the sill. Jumbles, for the uninitiated, and shame on your pastry lexicon if that's you, were sturdy little cookies twisted into elegant knots and flavoured with aniseed, which made them taste like licorice politely sniffing a bonnet. Mrs. Tittleman often told visitors that the jumbles recipe was handed down from a Dutch cousin with extremely strong opinions and extremely short arms. Not ideal for kneading, but excellent for judgment. Of course, like much of local history, this may not have been technically accurate, but was spiritually sublime. On this particular day, Mrs. Tittleman allowed Thistlewick into the back kitchen, a holy sanctuary of bubbling pots and sacred puff pastry. It was warm, softly golden, a room where even the shadows smelled edible. She handed him a wooden spoon still slick with dough and gave him a conspiratorial nod. "Now," she said, in a voice like warm syrup, "tell me, young man, can you keep a secret?" Thistlewick nodded, wide-eyed. He'd once gone a full 40 minutes without telling his sister about a dead frog he'd found. He was no stranger to heavy silence. Mrs. Tittleman tilted her head. "Good, because you, my spongy little apprentice, are about to help with the boarding house turnover. That's what we call it when the gingerbread men move into their custom-made sweets." She flung open a tall cabinet with much ceremony, revealing a gingerbread house as elaborate as a Baroque opera, complete, with sugar glass windows and pipe cleaner chimneys. It had little candy stairs and a lobby where jelly bean guests were arranged as if attending a candlelit gala. "That," she said, gesturing proudly with a mixing ladle, is the Grand Sweet Marsh Hotel. Built in one afternoon and zoned entirely in peppermint. Her eyes twinkled, and Thistlewick felt very certain that no parliament anywhere, not even a dessert-based one, could make a place more magical than this. Outside, the snow had begun again. Slow, drifting flakes that seemed determined to rest gently on buttery eaves and licorice rooftops until further instructions arrived. And somewhere in the flickering warmth, another plan was rising, as gently and unquestioningly as dough left near the fire. The town green had frozen solid by early December, a great white saucer where children skated in boots too big and mittens knit by aunts who only vaguely remembered what size children grew to. Young Edgar Yorp, aged 8 and shaped rather like a turnip in a felt coat, wore 3 mismatched scarves and a hat handed down from 2 cousins and 1 badger, judging by the smell. The ice crunched soothingly beneath grubby boots as Edgar practiced minor locomotion, wobbling in wide ovals with all the poise of a sleeping goose. He was learning to skate, but what his joints were learning was that gravity was still in charge and had a comprehensive syllabus. Off to the side, the elder townsfolk stood sipping cups of something hot and questionably brewed. There had once been a sign beside the wide kettle over the coals that read mulled cider, but it had fallen behind a bale of hay sometime in 1904, and nobody had thought to retrieve it. The beverage changed slightly every year depending on who stirred it. Some years it was mostly apples, other years mostly sociology. But it was always warm, and it always cleared the sinuses. Skating was a community event, much like pudding judging and speculative weather conversations. It required no invitation, only ankle stability and a certain willingness to fall upon one's dignity. One could, in fact, measure one's social standing in town precisely by how many times one's posterior met the ice. An aristocratic tumble usually drew gasps, while a child's 6th fall that hour might prompt only polite clapping from nearby ducks. Aunt Liddy was there too, not skating of course. She hadn't skated since the Cornish Lard Festival of '79, when a rather bold pirouette landed her in the mayor's lap and inspired a small but festive lawsuit. She was knitting with stern concentration, forging what appeared to be a woolen cylinder, designed either for a dog with 3 heads or a child with delusions of fashion. Occasionally, she'd glance up and shout things like, "Bend the knees, not the plot," or more gliding, fewer existential crises. Her advice was mostly ignored, but appreciated nonetheless. Near the edge of the rink, a stall puffed warm smoke into the air, manned by Mr. Bartleby Sneed, who could be counted on to provide roasted chestnuts and unsolicited local history. His chestnuts were burnt with love and salt, and his stories were roasted in equal measure. "As I always say," he began, handing a paper bag of charred joy to young Maudie Carp, "the ice is better since the wool dyers went out of business. Used to be, you'd skate and come out the other end purple." Maudie nodded solemnly, as though trying to remember if she'd ever been involuntarily tie-dyed. Bartleby continued, brow furrowing. "Why, back then, when the river froze all the way out to the turnpike, we'd go sleigh riding by moonlight. Course the moon was bigger then, or perhaps the sleighs were smaller, one or the other, but certainly not both. Meanwhile, the church bells struck 5, echoing through the dusk like a cozy yawn. With every peal, families turned for home, faces ruddy, scarves trailing like sleepy dragons behind them. The rink emptied slowly, reluctantly, with the sigh of snow settling under boot prints. The winter dusk was the sort that tricked you into thinking it was midnight by tea time. and the lamplighters had begun their slow, poetic shuffle down Main Street, tapping each corner into golden bloom. Little Edgar, now damp in several areas, and having learned how to stop mostly by grabbing at other children, was scooped up by his father and gently tucked under one arm like a leaking loaf of bread. His skates dangled like medals from the great campaign of the afternoon, and in his gloved hand he carried a roasted chestnut, now cold, but a trophy all the same. As the last child slipped from the ice and the stars began to gather like shy sheep overhead, the green returned to its midday silence, ready again for snow angels, quiet midnight strolls, and the occasional lost sled. And in a crooked chimney not far away, a curl of smoke danced upward, as though it too were heading home for supper. Which brings us next through the back parlour, where the true battle of the holiday, wrapping paper versus scissors, is about to begin. The snow had begun to fall again, timidly this time, as if it were embarrassed by its earlier enthusiasm. It flitted down in tiny flurries, soft as moths, settling reluctantly on rooftops and the shivering backs of carolers who seemed unsure whether to sing or complain. In our little town, forever nestled under a woolen grey sky that looked suspiciously like it had been knit by someone's grandmother, the snowfall turned every familiar street into a lullaby. And on just such an evening, with chimney smoke curling into the clouds like sleepy questions, we were taken on what Great-Uncle Theo called a pre-Christmas mission of minor but lasting consequence. This, we later learned, meant visiting the draper's shop to help pick out ribbon for wrapping gifts, he claimed. But I suspect he just liked the way ribbon felt between two fingers. Cool, whispery, and otherwise of no great purpose. One rarely sees men of action so devoted to textiles. The draper's was a place of quiet enchantment, a long, narrow shop where time seemed to fold itself neatly along with the petticoats. Its air was perfumed with camphor and starch, and old debates about hem lengths. Ribbons spilled like cascading rivers from drawers that stuck insistently, never quite opening without a muttered apology or minor negotiation. Miss Pinner, the clerk, may have been ancient. No one was certain. She was known to have once mended a tear in Lady Holdsworth's christening gown, some 60 Christmases prior. But as for the details, she'd only smile cryptically and adjust the pince-nez on her nose, as if the memory required fine-tuning. "You've come for the candy stripes?" she asked, as though reading our minds, or perhaps just remembering last year with unreasonable accuracy. Great-Uncle Theo, resplendently buttoned in a greatcoat several decades out of style, nodded gravely. A profound need for red and white, also perhaps something in cranberry. I have a niece with terribly modern tendencies. That would be cousin Eugenia, of course. She once wore trousers to the harvest fair, and spoke of bicycles with the same reverence others reserved for royal visitations. It was widely agreed, in hushed tones of course, that she might one day marry for love, or worse yet, intellect. As the ribbon was unspooled, all crisp and cheerful against the dark wood counter, I found myself peering at the dolls displayed high up on the shelves. They sat upright in little rows, glassy-eyed and still, vaguely menacing in their perfection. These weren't the softened rag dolls we played with at home, but the sort who might glare at you for improper grammar. "I once got told off by one of those," whispered my brother Emmett solemnly. "Miss Pinner said I imagined it, but I heard her plain as day. 'Don't tug my hair, you lout. Told you that one with the beads is ex-military.'" The shopping mission drifted along dreamily, interrupted only when a somewhat harried apprentice emerged from the back room, flour on his apron. which puzzled everyone until it was revealed that the storeroom shared a wall with a bakery. This revelation caused Great Uncle Theo to nod and remark, "Strategic architecture. Can't tie a proper bow if one is not well fed on Eccles cakes." And that naturally led to our next stop. Burton's Bakery had survived 2 fires, the short-lived pudding riots of 1832 and one poorly considered attempt at a health-conscious scone. It did not traffic in whimsy or moderation. No, Burton's dealt exclusively in the sublime. Crusts like lullabies, pastries that sighed when bitten, and a peppermint fudge that briefly convinced Aunt Agnes to give up her minor addiction to Latin mottos. We left with paper-wrapped bundles warm enough to thaw mittened hands and tongues dusted in flowery confession. On these set, walk back through the pillowed streets, with the snow just politely kissing the tops of our boots now. I overheard Miss Pinner's voice echoing faintly in my memory. "Christmas," she'd murmured, "is no time for haste or half-hearted bows." Wise words, especially in a town where even the clock tower seemed to sleep a little longer in December. Back home, the fire was a sleepy beast glowing in the grate. Coats steamed gently by the door, and Mother was rearranging the oranges in a bowl, as though the house must be utterly symmetrical before St. Nicholas approved. I settled into the armchair with a biscuit too soft to resist, thinking of spools of ribbon still twirling in my thoughts like dreams that hadn't decided what to become. Outside, the wind sighed over the rooftops, carrying a promise of fresh snow and the faintest scent of cinnamon. And just before my eyes closed completely, I heard someone say, perhaps in my mind, or perhaps just beyond it, that tomorrow would be the day of the postman's grand holiday speech. Not a soul ever understood a word of it, but oh, how the town never missed a syllable. The snow had settled on the rooftops like icing sugar on a particularly ambitious sponge cake, though far less sweet and significantly colder to the touch. The sleepy little town, pretending not to notice how picturesque it had become, tucked itself deeper under the weight of winter. Warm yellow windows glowed drowsily in the dusk, and smoke curled from chimneys in lazy question marks, as though the houses were mildly pondering supper. Tonight was the 23rd of December, and something unspeakably thrilling was afoot. Mrs. Netherby was hosting her annual Christmas Eve punch and pantomime rehearsal. Now, pantomimes in our old country town were not so much performances as they were a gentle test of how many characters could forget their lines at once while wearing absolutely preposterous costumes. It was the sort of theatre where the dragon costume was clearly stitched from curtains, the beanstalk was a mop, and Cinderella's coach was unmistakably a wheelbarrow with fairy lights. But none of that mattered, because Mrs. Netherby's punch could erode sorrow. It had apples bobbing in it, mysterious orange peels floating like tropical hammocks, and a mischievous steam that made your nose feel like it had strolled into a storybook. She claimed the recipe had come from her great-uncle Percival, who once sold oranges in Gibraltar and swore British sailors were cured of all ailments by liberal exposure to citrus and gossip. Constance, our sleepy little narrator, had been chosen, somewhat controversially, as the back half of the pantomime cow. This was not, as some might think, a slight. On the contrary, it came with tremendous responsibility. The front half could grin and mug and bow, but the back had to maintain elegance, coordination and balance, all while navigating drafts and errant gingerbread wrappers. Constance, dignified soul that she was, rose, back half and all, to the occasion. Rehearsals were held in the draughty village hall, that noble barn of memory stuffed with creaking chairs and faintly suspicious stage curtains. It smelled faintly of old violets, stale cake, and community ambition. Someone had lit a fire at one point in 1911, and legend had it the same ember still glowed faintly in the grate, muttering about the war. This year's story was Jack and the Baked Bean Pie, reimagined by the vicar's wife during a particularly long Advent. It was a tale of courage and legumes, wherein Jack defeats the giant not with a sword, but with an upset stomach. The cast was a marvel of invention. Mrs. Poulter, aged 92 and mostly deaf, played Jack's daring grandmother, who stole scenes simply by knitting throughout. Young Timothy Higginbotham, aged 9 and half a biscuit tall, was the terrifying giant, his roars cleverly enhanced by his father shaking a tin roof sheet backstage. Mr. Bentwhistle, the town dentist and surprise baritone, played both the bean and the pie in a daring dual role, wearing a costume that was more ambition than fabric. As the piano wheezed its way through Good King Wenceslas, like a wheezy old dog climbing stairs, and the cast tripped over one another with enthusiasm and only minor injuries, Constance stood, 2 hooves deep in her felt costume, and smiled the sort of smile you can only manage when your rear end is covered in sequins and the whole town loves you anyway. Up at the front of the room, Mrs. Netherby stirred her punch with a ladle far older than several of her guests, and declared, in the same tone used for decisive battle cries and the start of bake sales, "Christmas is in the air, my darlings, and possibly nutmeg." Someone sang the wrong verse of Deck the Halls. The lights flickered sympathetically, and the pantomime cow bumped gently into the pie. Laughter swelled like rising dough. Outside, snow began to fall again, swirling past the window panes like secrets, soft-edged and ancient. Inside, the warmth gathered, stitched together by tea, performance anxiety, and spiced cheer. And as the final act of rehearsal devolved into improvised tap dancing and a rogue tambourine, Constance looked up, for now the cow's back half had a view, and saw, across the stage, Mr. Tiddle from the haberdashery belting Silent Night, with his eyes closed and his bunting tangled round his hat. The moment felt somehow entirely perfect. But beyond the laughter, the punch, and the delightfully wobbly scenery, something else waited. A tradition older than stockings and even mince pies, passed down quietly, like a whispered lullaby. And that, dear dreamer, is what we must visit next. Upstairs, in the eaves of the old house where the roof slanted like a thoughtful sigh, the attic waited with quiet, moth-perfumed dignity. No one in the family ever called it the attic. That was too spooky, too shadowy, far too dramatic. It was simply referred to as the upstairs up above. And just now, it bustled respectfully with the whispered industry of seasonal rummaging. It was Walter's idea, though Walter ideas tended to begin as idle thoughts, take the form of grand missions, and collapse somewhere between a sneeze and a biscuit. But this particular Walter idea, had stuck long enough for 2 cousins, Aunt Ginny, and a mostly willing cat, to climb into the upstairs up above in search of the Christmas box. Every family had a Christmas box, or 12. They never lived where you left them. One year, it would be tucked behind the trunks that held great-grandfather's military jackets, complete with brass buttons that now knew only dust and spiders. The next, it would have wandered cheerfully to the corner where the old velocipede leaned like a tired gentleman. And there it was, or rather, there they were, stacked, leaning, vaguely box-shaped items, all bearing the curious charm of a 19th century storage solution. String instead of tape, faded labels written in a spidery hand, and a certain eternal smell of pine, candle wax, and last-century optimism. Walter, who had the curiosity of a small archaeologist and the balance of a sack of flour, tore into the topmost box with the drama of a man uncovering an ancient tomb. Out came lengths of wax-dipped holly garland, half-melted beeswax figures of shepherds with mysteriously missing limbs, and a musty robe that might once have been part of a nativity, but now carried the look of something a wizard might wear on laundry day. It was, according to Aunt Ginny, the best bit of Christmas time, rediscovering the same oddities year after year, marvelling that they had survived, and pretending not to remember how truly hideous the papier-mâché donkey had always been. And yet, it was their donkey, with paint chips flaking like ancient frescoes and eyes that seemed to say, "Yes, I've seen things." The cat, who'd come up solely to nap among the ribbons, pawed disdainfully at a cracked snow globe. In it, a miniature town twinkled under glass, stubborn glitter snow clinging to the rooftops. The church steeple inside listed slightly, which, if you squinted, made it look rather like the village cobbler after 2 mugs of warm brandied milk. "Aha!" Walter shouted triumphantly, holding aloft a doll-sized red sweater. "Stockings." "Those are not stockings," said Cousin Elsie. "That's a sweater for a goose." Indeed, it was the long-lost Christmas goose sweater, hand-knit by Great-Aunt Maureen. During the year she insisted all poultry should be made modest before roasting. The memory had long entered family legend, right alongside the great rice pudding incident, and the year the pudding really did catch fire exactly when the vicar walked in. There, among the boxes, the rustle of tissue paper and the scent of ornament dust and chilly wood beams, the children began pulling out the decorations, not to hang them just yet, but to inspect them like museum curators discovering relics from their own recent past. One bauble bore the words Merry 85 in glitter glue, now slightly unglued. It was not entirely clear which 85 this referred to. Aunt Ginny claimed it was 1885, but Walter suspected it was 1985, and someone had gone a bit heavy on the antique enthusiasm. And there, at the bottom of the last brown box, wrapped in a yellowed bit of newsprint from a 1902 copy of the Weekly Telegraph, headline, "Local Man Claims Pig Predicted Rainfall," was the angel for the top of the tree. Slightly bent, wings askew, one arm missing, a porcelain tribute to whatever happened to toys when no one was looking. The angel had once held a tiny harp, now gone, and instead had a note pinned to her sash that read, from a child of Christmases past, "Fix later." Later, as we all know, is one of the attic's favourite residents. As the cousins packed everything back down for another day, each candle, each creased bit of festive history, they tiptoed with reverence, not just for the items, but for the invisible fingerprints of every December that came before, the kind of memories you could almost smell. A sophisticated bouquet of cinnamon, coal dust, and slightly rained-on mittens. With the attic slumbering again behind them, they descended the narrow stairs in single file, giggling softly, the cat bringing up the rear with an ornament caught on its tail. And as twilight painted the old town in shades of pudding and plum, somewhere between history and dinner, there floated the unmistakable scent of mince pies baking, which could only mean one thing. The kitchen battle for the last piece of crust was just beginning. By the time morning turned properly gold and the chimney smoke stretched out like lazy thoughts overhead, the shopkeepers had already dusted their windows for the Saturday before Christmas. Bell ropes had been polished, sills tidied, and every tray of nutmeg buns or cinnamon twists was confidently displayed as if auditioning for a plum role in a festive painting. Our little country town, with all its curls and corners, was not made for rushing. It disguised parcels of time beneath cobblestones and behind lace curtains, and anyone who expected urgency from its lanes would soon find themselves sipping tea in a mild state of disappointment. This particular morning, the excitement was a quiet one, like a cat watching snowfall. Archie, a boy very good at finding interesting ways to postpone his chores, had wandered into the town square with the full intention of accidentally losing track of time. He hunched his shoulders with the misguided sophistication of someone who intended to buy a loaf of bread and instead purchased something involving clockwork or licorice. He carried 3 pennies, 1 ginger snap, and a vague hope that something memorable would happen. "Is Mrs. Tewkesbury's goose for show or sale?" he asked gravely, staring through the window of the butcher's, where a large, glistening goose, enthroned upon kale and orange slices, glowed as though it had been basted with candlelight itself. "Display goose," said Mr. Godfrey the butcher, without looking up. "She won't part with it unless Christmas forgets to arrive." Archie nodded to show gravity. "I see," he lied, and wandered on. It was here, mid-wander, that he came upon the daylight performance of Mr. Grindle's automated carolling orchestra. For the uninitiated, or those of you whose idea of entertainment does not include Victorian mechanical oddities, this was a contraption that involved a wind-up crank, several air-blown harmoniums, and 6 papier-mâché heads vaguely resembling angels in the middle of dental surgery. The heads sang carols, in a manner of speaking. They wheezed Good King Wenceslas, with a tone that suggested both minor internal suffering and major miscalibration. And yet, children adored it. Those small enough not to know better, and wise enough to know joy when they heard it, gathered there with sticky fingers and sparkling eyes. The machine, which took 4 hours to wind and 19 minutes to perform, was the pride of Mr. Grindle's life. Around it, he had built an entire seasonal philosophy. A child with sufficient patience could receive a boiled sweet only if they refrained from crying before verse 3. "I am refining culture," Mr. Grindle would say, polishing one of the wax noses that tended to slide down in warmer weather. Children must endure the arts. For parents, it was more of an endurance sport, but for the town officials, who preferred Mr. Grindle engaged with music than politics, the machine was worth every penny not spent on something louder. Archie, of course, stood and listened attentively, as any boy would, when presented with the opportunity to procrastinate under the noble veil of artistry. He chewed his last ginger snap with forced solemnity and felt that something very nearly magical might happen, if only the choir didn't sound like they were battling bronchitis. Just then, a twig of snow began to drift down, like a polite suggestion from the clouds. 1 flake, then 2, drifting sideways like bashful dancers. The gaslights flickered. The children stopped talking. You could even hear the last note from the cherubic automaton taper off into a mechanical cough. The wide windows of the town hall reflected all of it. The turning gears, the small faces, the eager snow, and behind them all, a kind of shimmer that only rose in December, the shimmer of secrets and stories and mischief to be had in mittens. Archie turned to go, now gooseless but full of some sleepy excitement he couldn't quite name, the kind of gladness that doesn't need a reason, only a season. And as the snow thickened like chilled sugar over roofs and ridges, something curious was beginning. Up the hill, where the older houses stood, and the children dared one another to climb the iron gate after sundown. But that, dear listener, is best left to unfold in its own sweet time. The snow had taken hold of every roof tile and window ledge in the town, with the kind of determined grip usually reserved for retiring generals and stubborn great-aunts. By the time Christmas Eve tiptoed in, the lanes wore powdered cloaks, and the gas lamps flickered like bashful stars too shy to join the proper sky. In the heart of this hush, old Mr. Pincushion, not his Christian name, but certainly his legendary one, had set about his most important yearly duty, selecting the town's ceremonial Christmas goose. There were no official decrees that made this his responsibility, but no one had objected for so many winters that it felt, by now, more sacred than law. Each year, in his scuffed boots and flapping scarf, he trundled down to the poultry yard just past the old brewery ruins, which now housed more ghosts than beer. There, surrounded by honking suspects, he'd perform what he called the ancient eye test. He'd stare deeply into the goose's face. "That one has cunning," he would say, gesturing at a drowsy-looking hen. "Won't do. You can't have cunning in Christmas dinner." So the town respected it, not the reasoning precisely, but the certainty with which it was applied. And though it wasn't exactly a democratic process, the children believed fiercely in his goose-choosing magic. Little Beatrice Culpepper once claimed that the goose Mr. Pincushion selected would always taste 17% better, regardless of seasoning. No one really knew how she arrived at that number, but she did have a chart. The chosen goose would be presented at the Christmas Eve gathering in the town hall, a noble building that still had cannonball dents from the War of 1731, which, to everyone's great confusion, had apparently been fought entirely by mistake due to a misunderstood insult involving a duck, 3 foreign dignitaries, and a mistranslation of the word hereditary. Inside the town hall, villagers bustled with gentle excitement. The hall smelled of clove-studded oranges, boiled custards, and elderly wool. An enormous fir tree stood at the centre, decorated with hand-dipped candles and ornaments made from salt dough and firm creative intention. Paper chains sagged politely from beam to beam, as if reluctant to intrude. The grown-ups fussed over tables, while the children, drunk on gingerbread and wild optimism, darted between legs and benches like rogue sparrows. Mabel Thistlewhip played a trembly version of "O Come All Ye Faithful" on a concertina, while 3 older gentlemen discussed, with intensifying confusion, whether nutmeg was patriotic or foreign. The jury remained out. Somewhere near the fireplace, Uncle Hector had launched into his annual retelling of the Great Plum Pudding incident, wherein, one Christmas, a rogue flaming pudding had briefly caught fire and flown directly into the mayor's lap. He had, they all said, leapt with the elegance of a frightened trout. But what made this particular Christmas Eve shimmer with extra golden edges was the arrival of a parcel from Aunt Fanny, shipped all the way from her diplomatic posting in Vienna. Aunt Fanny was generally regarded as the adventurous one, having once learned to speak 4 languages by accident. She had a habit of sending mysterious packages that delighted, alarmed, and baffled in equal measure. This year, inside the brown paper wrappings, lay something astonishing: a gingerbread clock tower, exquisitely detailed, entirely edible, and taller than the vicar. Rumour had it she'd commissioned it from a retired pastry chef who once baked desserts for Austrian royalty and still referred to himself unnecessarily as his dessertship. The gingerbread tower had working sugar windows, peppermint clock hands, and a little marzipan bell that insisted softly and with dignity, on falling off. The town gathered around in reverent awe. No one dared eat it just yet. Even Mr. Pincushion took off his cap, held it to his chest and whispered, "By the custards of yore." It was placed on the centre table beneath a fall of paper snowflakes. It would not last the night, but for now, it was a monument, a sugary cathedral to Christmas, memory, and the slightly unhinged generosity of distant relatives. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, the warmth piled up thick as pudding. But even as the carol started and the tinsel shimmered, there was still one very vital tradition yet to come. Something only the children dared attempt, and something that would involve more sleigh bells than sense. At precisely 1 minute past 4 on Christmas Eve, the grocer's shop became a theatre of epic domestic diplomacy, and I, an undersized ambassador of sweets, was dispatched into the fray. Snowflakes were gentling down like dandruff onto the shoulders of old Mr. Blenkinsop, who stood guard outside the shop like an increasingly frosty cucumber. Inside, the air was thick with the scents of oranges, cinnamon, and mild seasonal panic. Mrs. Trimble, the grocer's wife, kept a peppermint-scented, Soviet-style grip on inventory, while her husband moved about like a ballet dancer who'd lost his slippers. The place was delicious chaos. Towers of biscuits teetered dangerously near barrels of pickled onions, and children were lined up like patient sausages, each holding tightly to a precious ration coupon and a mental list of Yuletide demands. The wartime Christmas had left its mark. Even a decade later, some old habits died harder than the toffee. Tins of corned beef were stacked beside novelty Santa soaps, and there was a small sign that read, "Only 2 Oz of goose fat per family, no exceptions, even if related to a bishop." My own task was noble and grave. Procure precisely 6 sugar mice for Aunt Bessie's annual Christmas Eve tea, during which she would claim, as always, to only take 1 bite before dispatching the whole platoon of confectionery rodents behind her hand-knitted shawl. Sugar mice, in case you're unfamiliar, are about 4 parts sugar, 1 part whimsy, and wholly inadvisable for anyone hoping to keep their teeth past retirement. As I waited in line, humming some half-remembered carol that looped relentlessly around the same 3 off-key notes, I watched a scene of pure Edwardian beauty unfold across the counter. An elderly man in an overcoat more patch than wool requested 3 ounces of dates, a half-pound of suet, and 1 small jar of peppermint oil, because he insisted peppermint oil kept one's innards festive. A claim no doctor had ever confirmed, but few dared to challenge. Behind him, little Aggie Midwinter. We called her Agile Aggie, though no one remembered why. Not so much walked as hovered with impatience, clutching a length of ribbon and a tin soldier named Admiral Toast. Her mother warned her to behave, or Father Christmas would bring her nothing but turnips. Aggie replied flatly, "Turnips are plant souls," which, while not technically historical fact, is precisely the sort of sentence you only hear in towns that have too many ghosts and not enough toys. The grocer reached into the glass jar of sugar mice, which sparkled like legend trapped in cellophane snow. He picked out 6 precisely with his brass sugar tongs, which had belonged, legend had it, to his great-grandfather, who had once tonged sweets for Queen Victoria's corgis. Fact or fancy, the mice were mine. Wrapped in a twist of brown paper, they felt like treasure, even if slightly misshapen, and with 1 ear melted, a price of doing business near the roaring heat of the bread oven. Outside the shop, the gas lights flickered with the shivery optimism of Victorian engineering. Icicles hung down like punctuation from the eaves, emphasizing the sentence of winter that curled round every corner of the town. The windows of nearby houses glowed with lamps and shadowy figures setting out biscuit trays and polishing their best crockery, as if the whole town was preparing for either dinner or a small-scale amateur opera. With the sugar mice secured in my mittens, I shuffled home over the cobblestones, accompanied by the sweet music of sleigh bells from no apparent source. Some said it was just Mr. Evans and his cart horse, but I preferred to imagine it was the ghost of a Roman chariot, outdoing its Christmas rounds. History was full of ghosts this time of year. Charles Dickens himself more or less turned it into a seasonal requirement, and if you listen closely just then, past the creak of lamplight and the sigh of the wind under Aunt Bessie's laundry line, you may have heard something else. A deep, sleepy chuckle, as if Father Christmas himself had just slipped on a mince pie somewhere above the town. But before we return to our sleepy parlour and the ember-lit corners of the holiday evening, there awaits one more journey, one filled with carols, crumpets, and the sudden, mysterious disappearance of Cousin Horace's moustache wax. Snow fell differently that Christmas Eve afternoon, soft and confident, like it already knew it would be remembered fondly. The drifts along the rooftops formed gentle waves, like frosting piped lovingly on gingerbread houses by a confectioner with a sense of architecture and a flair for whimsy. Every flake seemed to come with its own agenda. Some chose to lounge idly on the velvet shoulders of cloaks and mufflers, while others trespassed boldly into the boots of unlucky errand boys who returned home with toes as damp as oversteeped tea bags. In our old country town, the hour between lunch and twilight was a sacred, meandering one. Shopkeepers fluffed displays of sugared plums and the occasional suspiciously shiny apple. The butcher's window, which frankly had no business trying to look festive, still managed some garland and a stuffed pheasant, wearing a rather jaunty bow tie. And on the cobbled square near the church, a slow, tuneful clanging began as the bell ringer tested the carillon in preparation for midnight mass. Each bell note fell like a plop of warm syrup upon a quiet stack of pancakes, deliberate, slow, and just a bit sticky. But inside our own narrow little house, behind the frosty panes and the looped evergreen wreath that had welcomed more squirrels than carolers, another kind of quiet preparation was underway. Great Aunt Thistlewick was making plum pudding, an act requiring bravery, dexterity, and a knowledge of dried fruit distribution that bordered on the arcane. As a child, I watched from the doorframe, feeling I was witnessing some ancient ritual. Her sleeves were rolled defiantly past the elbow, and her cheeks bore the flush of a woman squinting suspiciously at nutmeg, as if daring it not to belong. Plum pudding, despite its name, famously includes neither fresh plums nor anything pud-like in texture. Its name is a linguistic relic, the way dialing a phone clings to us, despite rotary devices joining the dodo and decency in extinction. In centuries past, plums meant raisins and currants. Clearly, the people of Old England played rather fast and loose with their fruit definitions, perhaps due to a general lack of entertainment. Aunt Thistlewick's recipe was older than the town, worn at the corners and stained with tragic molasses decisions of Christmases long past. Each year she added a coin to the mix, an old silver sixpence, to bring luck to whomever found it, provided they didn't break a tooth in the process. Nothing says festive family bonding quite like the risk of oral injury in pursuit of fortune. The mixing was communal, and as it turned out, incredibly windy, and each of us had to take a turn stirring the bowl clockwise while making a wish. This tradition dated back to the early 1600s, when the British decided that dessert would now be an act of collective civil responsibility. We all lined up, the children with eagerness, the grown-ups with caution, and grandfather with a spoon the size of a canoe paddle. Once stirred, the pudding was steamed for hours until it emerged like a glorious sticky meteor pulled from the depths of space and shrouded in a very pleasant aroma of clove and mystery. It would not be eaten until Christmas Day, but merely knowing it existed, napping under a thick cloth in the larder like a well-fed hedgehog, made the house feel filled with something quietly magical. Meanwhile, the parlour had become a battleground of pine needles and ambition, as the Christmas tree was undergoing its final embellishments. The tree stood proud, but rather self-conscious, in the corner beside the hearth, as if slightly unsure whether all this glitter was becoming or a bit much. We hung paper stars, dried orange slices, delicate blown glass baubles from Bavaria, donated long ago by cousin Lotta, who claimed, probably falsely, to be half princess, and strings of popcorn that had taken Aunt Mab the better part of a fortnight because she kept eating every third kernel. Tinsel, which in earlier centuries was made from real silver, yes, meltable, tarnishable, heavy, actual silver, sparkled in the firelight. Ours, however, was mostly plastic and hope, twinkling cheerfully nonetheless. It was hard to imagine past Christmases with weighty garlands drooping solemnly on wax candles, watched nervously by family members holding buckets and saying things like, "Well, if the drapes go up, we'll just smother it with pudding." And as the sun edged lower behind the frosty hills, casting long mauve shadows across the way, the house settled into a kind of quiet with ambition, the sound of something just on the brink of becoming more magical. The scent of citrus, soot, cinnamon, and rich ancestry seeped into the walls like a balm. Tomorrow, everything would glow, but tonight was stillness, warmth, and softly humming bells. And just beyond the staircase, in the old trunk grandfather fetched down with the usual tug and muttered expletive, lay something extraordinary waiting to be unwrapped at last. Under the low winter sky of the old country town, where the chimney smoke rose like sleepy ribbon dancers into the pearly hush of afternoon, the post office loomed, or rather lolled, atop the gentle slope of Market Street. It was a squat, square building that somehow managed to look both thoroughly unimpressed and deeply important at the same time, like a headmaster who had seen it all and still insisted you remove your mittens indoors. On this particular December day, the doors of the post office flapped and thudded with the urgency of townsfolk delivering last-minute Christmas parcels, which, in those days, were mostly socks, wrapped lovingly in brown art paper, or oranges tied up in newspaper as if contraband in wartime. And in many places, they were, in fact, contraband. Oranges, not socks. Inside, the air smelled of wet wool, sealing wax, and the oddly cheerful dampness of ink blotters. Behind the counter stood Mr. Buntley, the postmaster, who had a moustache stalactite and an ability to sort mail with hypnotic slowness. Children would come in for the thrill of sending letters to the North Pole, which Mr. Buntley accepted with the solemn nod of a man who secretly suspected Santa lived in Basingstoke and commuted. But always, there was Mrs. Penwiggle. Now, Mrs. Penwiggle wasn't employed by the post office, but rather stationed herself there each December with a stack of postcards, a thermos of treacle tea, and an impenetrable sense of purpose. No one knew precisely why. Some said she wrote to relatives in Canada. Others whispered she was corresponding with the ghost of Admiral Nelson. Either way, she was a holiday fixture as dependable as chilblains and Beecham's powders. Each card she wrote was addressed in looping cursive that tangled across the paper like ivy after 2 sherries. She'd glance up at interruptions with a gaze as sharp as peppermint bark. Only once had someone asked to borrow her pen, a regrettable mistake that led to a 15-minute lecture on fountain pen etiquette, including the proper way to apologize to a nib. On this day, however, young Edwin and his cousin Letty had been sent with a very important task: to post their family's annual Christmas greetings, all tied up with string and sealed up with a wax stamp showing a goose in formal attire. Not a particularly festive symbol, unless one had met the Gander family of Church Lane, whose patriarch did indeed go about in a monocle. Letty had the packet tucked securely under her arm and wore the expression of a courier charged with carrying the Magna Carta. Edwin, meanwhile, trailed behind in mittens that had once been red but now approximated the shade of leftover cranberry sauce. They arrived just as the post office bell dinged from a departing customer, and the distinctive sniff of Mrs. Penwiggle cut across the counterscape. "Mind the drop box, dear," she intoned without looking up, as Letty approached the brass-lettered slot. "It bites if you're not polite." Letty curtsied slightly, as one might to a duchess or a weathered park bench. Then, reverently, as if placing an offering before an altar, she fed the envelope into the slot. It thunked down with a hollow sort of whoomp, like a distant drumbeat in a toy soldier parade. From the back closet, someone, presumably Mr. Buntley, coughed in Morse code. Edwin, emboldened by the solemnity of the moment, wandered over to inspect an enormous wall chart titled "Postage Rates for Foreign Destinations." It was oddly thrilling to imagine that 9 pence and a stamp could send a message to Constantinople. Less thrilling was the fine print. Delivery times may vary occasionally by decades. "Oh, look," Letty whispered, pointing to a drawer labelled "Postal Curiosities." Inside lay an assortment of unmailed letters, odd-shaped parcels, and, intriguingly, a hat that possibly once held a pigeon. "There's magic in the mail," said Mrs. Penwiggle, as if reading their thoughts, especially when it's addressed to places people think are only pretend. Letty and Edwin looked at one another, their eyes wide, minds spinning with possibilities, messages in bottles, parcels to Atlantis, and Christmas cards addressed to Frost himself. Outside, the early sunset brushed the rooftops in sleepy hues of apricot and plum, and the post office bell dinged again, this time ushering a cabbage-scented old man in a muffler the size of a tent. Under that fading light, the children stepped back onto the cobbled street, waving briefly at Mrs. Penwiggle, who gave a regal nod in return and resumed penning. "Dear King Arthur, I hope this finds you well." The evening deepened. Snow flitted down with the aimless charm of feathers in a pillow fight, and the gas lamps blinked awake with a yawn. As they made their way homeward, Letty paused, tilted her head toward the sky, and said softly, "I wonder if letters ever float all the way to the stars." Edwin, too tired to ponder celestial postage logistics, merely nodded, and they walked on, boots scuffing through sugar snow, into the quiet hush of the closing day. And behind them, the lamplighter approached with a ladder, humming something that would echo merrily into the next unfolding hour. It was on the 15th evening of Advent, just as the winter sun surrendered without much fanfare behind the gables of the church hall, that the town's annual Christmas light judging committee assembled, all 3 of them, dressed in their earnestest coats and their longest scarves, ready to fulfill their solemn Yuletide duty. This small but mighty assembly consisted of Mrs. Butterfield, lace-gloved and bracingly opinionated about icicle lights, Mr. Penworthy, who had once been a gas lamp maintenance apprentice in the 1880s and still seemed mildly shocked by electricity in general, and young Miss Hester Topple, whose only qualification was that she could see in the dark better than anyone else, owing to an unusual diet rich in carrots and bored curiosity. Their mission: to wander about the winding lanes and bramble-snuggling cottages of the town after sundown, awarding hand-drawn certificates and mild congratulations to those deemed to have strung their holly boughs and candlelit windows in the spirit of the season, which no one had ever precisely defined, though Mrs. Butterfield insisted it meant a restraint with the flickering Santas. And Mr. Penworthy took it mostly as not electrocuting one's hedge. Every year, this event sparked a quiet, polite rivalry, the kind only fully experienced amongst people prone to apologizing to lampposts they accidentally bump into. Mr. Janney, at Thistlewick Close, for example, had hosted a rather alarming tableau the year prior that involved 4 wooden elves, an animatronic reindeer, and a sound loop of someone humming "O Come All Ye Faithful" at a slightly desperate tempo. He'd been awarded Best Effort, which everyone knew was the polite equivalent of "Dear Heavens, try something else." This year, however, lights glowed a little softer and candles twinkled more warmly in the slowly freezing windows of the town. Perhaps it was the thick snow that had fallen in a manner so theatrically fluffy that even the local cats surrendered their nocturnal prowling and simply peered, rather philosophically, from porch steps. Or perhaps word had gently travelled through tea parties and postmasters that the committee was now particularly partial to systems involving classic candelabra silhouettes and deeply suspicious of inflatables of any kind. As the committee walked, though floated majestically in practical boots, might better describe Mrs. Butterfield's gait, they passed from lantern-lit cottages to dry stone-walled lanes, nodding clinically at fairy lights and murmuring compliments such as agreeably twinkly and not bad at all for modern bulbs. One home in particular caught their collective breath, though Mr. Penworthy coughed his out again, having accidentally inhaled a snowflake. The house belonged to old man Widdershins, a semi-retired glockenspiel tuner with a beard like a butter-churned thundercloud and a long-standing refusal to participate in anything organised, including seasonal sentiment. But this year, his cottage windows flickered with warm candlelight. No electricity, no fanfare, just simple orange glows resting behind curtain lace, reflecting quietly off the snow-cloaked cobblestones. It was impossibly perfect, almost as though Charles Dickens himself had baked it from scratch using cinnamon and nostalgia. Mrs. Butterfield fanned her gloved hands beneath her chin and whispered something like, "Oh my stars." Miss Hester blinked twice to confirm it wasn't loveliness-induced snow-blindness. Mr. Penworthy adjusted his hat with a ponderous sigh and declared, "He's won, hasn't he? Blasted Widdershins. Did nothing for 50 years and now he topples the lot of us with 2 candles and a pine wreath." They left him a certificate tucked into his boot scraper that read, "Spirit of Christmas." Immediately started arguing over whether the border should have had holly or ivy, and declared the tour complete. As they wandered off into the night, their footprints quickly dissolved under new, powdery flurries like icing sugar shaken over memory. Meanwhile, within his lovely glowing cottage, Widdershins himself, snuggled in a red wool coat older than several governments, simply rocked back in a creaky chair by the hearth, drinking cider so spicy it could reprimand a schoolchild from 30 yards. He'd lit those candles because, in truth, he couldn't find the matches for his electric lamp and had grown fond of the flicker. A small accident then, but one that won first prize. History is full of such happy accidents, like penicillin, or the microwave, or the moment someone realized pine trees indoors could be quite festive and were only mildly flammable. Outside, the stars blinked gently. Inside, widdershins nodded and drifted off, the way only someone truly victorious and not remotely aware of it can sleep. And so, with glowing windows and frosted shingles catching moonlight just so, the old country town curled sleepily into another December night, softly turning the page into the next sleepy wonder of the season. By late afternoon, it had begun to snow in a rather performative way, softly, deliberately, as if the clouds had convened a union meeting and unanimously voted in favor of scenic flurries, the kind that drift in diagonals like thoughtful dancers, brushing over rooftops and coat collars, whispering things like, "Yes, yes, this is very picturesque," and "Don't forget to mention the jam tarts." The town stirred, but only just. Evening preparations hummed at a tempo somewhere between a sigh and a yawn. In kitchens, great-grandmothers in thick stockings measured flour by intuition and the arc of their elbows. Measurements were vague on purpose, inherited through generations of culinary telepathy, a smidge, a generous heap, and whatever fits in mother's favorite spoon. Of course, every family had its disagreements about what qualified as traditional. For example, in the Oatley household, minced pies were deemed sacred, and it was believed that burning the crust invited tragic weather in March. Meanwhile, over at the Mercers, a family known for playing competitive charades and quietly resenting the invention of margarine, a proper Christmas pudding had to include precisely 13 ingredients, one for Jesus and one for each of the disciples, including the famously unpredictable one. If anyone left out the nutmeg, Aunt Belinda would make a face like she'd just licked a battery. The boys, stuffed into itchy wool coats, rubbery boots, and scarves that doubled as minor architecture, had taken to the snowy streets in search of errands, drama, or biscuits. It was the kind of snow that inspired mischief, ideal for snowballs, but not yet cold enough to pass through mittens like treachery. They delivered tin-foiled bundles and received other ones in return. Orange spice loaves, small nuts wrapped in cracked newspaper, and once, quite unexpectedly, a ginger cat named Montgomery, who had insinuated himself into a basket of warm rolls and refused to evacuate. In the seclusion of the town church, Mrs. Buxton supervised the final rehearsal for the nativity tableau, with the sternness of a battle-hardened general and the weary optimism of someone who had just re-glued the angel's wing 3 times. Joseph had a head cold. The Star of Bethlehem had been misplaced behind the vestry's umbrella stand, and the innkeeper's no room at the inn line scene. Line had mysteriously expanded to include a soliloquy about housing regulations. As tradition dictated, the local historian, Reverend Pellamy, was invited to give a short reading on Yule in Elder Times, which he did with such slow, sonorous delivery that the organist usually nodded off around Saturnalian feast rites. Most of the children assumed this was all made up, like the bit about figgy pudding or the one special mince pie that sent the vicar into an ecstatic trance. But Reverend Pellamy would insist, at length and often, that our modern Christmas was cobbled together from many cheerful sources, including the Roman Saturnalia, where people traded gifts and misbehaved much like modern office parties, but with togas and fewer spreadsheets. He would lower his glasses to the tip of his nose, peer at the assembled crowd as if they were freshly carved pews, and declare that mistletoe had once been considered so sacred by the Druids that enemies in battle would call a truce beneath it. A charming notion, particularly in a town where Aunt Maisie and Mr. Spratt had been feuding for 23 years over the ownership of a handwritten scone recipe. Meanwhile, over at the Bernards' front room, the one that always smelled like cloves and carefully dusted history, Grandfather Bernard sat by the fire with a glass of port and a lapful of snoozing terrier, recounting to anyone half listening how, in his boyhood, they would dig a path through snow so deep it brushed the first-floor windows. Everyone nodded solemnly, even though photographic evidence suggested it had once snowed exactly 3 inches and melted shortly after breakfast. Outside, twilight blended into velvet blue. The lanterns along the cobbled walkways flickered with a golden flush, giving each snowflake a theatrical exit as it descended. Church bells chimed the hour in agreeably confused harmonies, somewhere between "God rest ye merry" and "Oops." And just as the clock edged towards 6, with the scent of roasted chestnuts curling through the alleys and the windows glowing like parcels waiting to be unwrapped, a hush fell across the town. Not full silence, mind you, more like a collective moment of listening, the kind reserved for distant sleigh bells or the telltale creak of someone sneaking an extra marzipan pig. Then, through the settling snow and the flicker of hearths behind little round glass panes, came the faint and rapidly approaching sound that would soon tug the town a half step closer to Christmas. But that part, as it happens, belongs to a slightly later hour. As the clock struck just past 5 and the sky turned the precise shade of plum reserved only for small-town winters, the candle wicks began their evening shift. In the snug homes lining the high street, grandmothers with precise wisdom lit them with exaggerated caution, as if each flicker might summon some Dickensian ghost. But no such ghosts appeared, not even the lazy kind that only haunt the pantry. Instead, it was the hour when the town's windows became little glowing lanterns, each one a soft theatre of domestic life. The kitchen at number 14, Elm Crescent, was particularly theatrical, and not because Mrs. Elspeth Wedderburn fancied herself a rather tragic Victorian heroine, although she certainly did. She moved about the scullery with a dramatic swirl of her apron, rearranging bowls of currants, prunes, and other preserved goodies whose only crime had been being dried sometime in early October. On the radio crackled that particular genre of 1940s Christmas carols, where everyone sounds like they're singing through a wool sock. Elspeth called it ambiance. Her husband called it a bit much. He said this crouched near the fire with toast in one hand and a gleam of quiet amusement in his eye. Only married people can disagree that softly. This evening was the beginning of mincemeat pie season, a time regarded with equal parts awe and digestive caution across town. In modern times, we assume such pies to be sweet, densely packed with nuts, fruit, a suspicious amount of cinnamon, and maybe a splash of rum that grandmother accidentally added twice. But historically, mincemeat pies were something altogether more daring. They contained, without apology, meat, beef to be precise, chopped and heavily spiced to the point of philosophical dislocation. The medieval concept was that sugar and meat weren't enemies. They were just old friends who hadn't yet realized they were terrible for each other. As Elspeth stirred her mixture, a bubbling cauldron of raisins, sweat, chopped apples, and vague optimism, she recounted to her visiting niece the ancient tale of the Puritan pie ban. Yes, in 1657, Oliver Cromwell and his band of festive fun killers outlawed Christmas foods they deemed unnecessarily enjoyable. Mincemeat pies were considered morally dangerous, not because of the raisins, but because people liked them too much, And in England, that's how you know something is suspicious. It's delicious and vaguely foreign. But times and pies had evolved. Elspeth's mincemeat contained no meat at all anymore, just the ghosts of cows past, and a hint of brandy that had spilled in, as if under mysterious circumstances. Her niece, ever the wide-eyed archivist of all family knowledge, asked if Christmas had always tasted this way. Elspeth, scraping mixture from the rim of the bowl with a spoon far too small for the task, remarked that Christmas tastes had changed just like Christmas trees, which, in her view, had gotten increasingly cheeky. The trees of her girlhood had been modest, real, and thin enough to lose things behind. Today's trees, especially in the windows of the rich folks on Woodbridge Road, looked like velvet opera singers, short and extravagant. They wore tinsel like jewelry and glowed with bulbs that blinked in a synchronized choreography known only to the elves who'd programmed them. Meanwhile, near the foot of Main Street, the town's bakery, Old Netherley's, a place that existed mostly in the present but smelled permanently of 1923, had just begun selling its famous treacle slabs. Sticky, dense, and legally categorized as both dessert and minor building material. They were wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Shop assistants were now trained to offer them flat, as one too many had been lost to gravity on the way out the door. This was a town that believed deeply and repeatedly in traditions. The annual pie swap was approaching, where families would trade their home-baked pies with their neighbours in what theorists might call a pre-modern dessert economy, and what Grandad Harold called culinary roulette. Children began gathering in snowy doorways to peek through parlour windows, noses smudging the cold glass. They watched mothers and fathers arrange nuts in bowls and quietly bemoan the cost of oranges. Oranges were luxurious. They had to be shared segment by segment, as if rationed by citrus diplomats. And every orange had a destiny, usually in a child's stocking, bruised upon arrival but carrying nonetheless the aroma of distant sun-warmed lands. Outside, snow had resumed its performance, soft and persistent as a bedtime lullaby. Flakes landed on windowsills and coat collars, on the stiff backs of ponies and the tilted caps of errand boys trudging home with parcels as light as goose feathers. Candles flickered in every corner now, warming stones, hearts, and forever the sharp corners of memory. And just as the pies slid into the oven, and the radio singer held his last woolly note under a blanket of static, Elspeth lifted her apron, sighed a deep and satisfied sigh, and said something about the scent of cloves that drifted like an old friend. Warm, unexpected, and very likely to overstay its welcome. The night continued its quiet descent toward wonder, or perhaps to the lane behind the bakery, where tomorrow's mischief would begin to take shape. The snow that had begun like a polite suggestion that morning had now decided to make a rather enthusiastic statement across the rooftops of the old country town. It gathered on window panes in thick frosted doilies, softened the sharp edges of chimneys, and attempted its very best to fill up every boot print like an overachieving volunteer in a holiday pudding line. Inside the Plumstone family parlour, 14 distinctly unmatching socks hung from the mantel with heroic optimism. Some were noticeably more optimistic than others. One bore a hole the size of a halfpenny, and another was clearly the top half of an old woolen undergarment with dreams of upcycling grandeur. But as far as Mr. Plumston was concerned, anything capable of holding an orange and 2 walnuts without weeping was a perfectly serviceable Christmas stocking. That evening, as the hour passed politely into its third candlestick, and the scent of cinnamon apples began its nightly patrol of the drawing rooms. The children were summoned to one of the house's most hallowed traditions, the building of the trifle. Now, you must understand, Victorian trifles were not trifles in the modern sense, where layers are calculated and carefully Instagrammed, and the custard is expected to behave. No, indeed. A true old-fashioned English trifle was less a dessert and more a loosely agreed-upon architectural movement. Some families used sponge cake, others pounded in old bits of fruitcake for structural integrity. Cream, jam, sherry, jelly. It was all there, layered like the geological record of one's kitchen pantry. In the Plumstone home, this ceremony was overseen by Aunt Bathsheba, a woman who believed boys could cure colds by sniffing mustard powder and who firmly regarded dessert as an act of loyalty to the empire. "You must respect the sponge," she declared, placing the first layer with reverence. "It died for your pleasure." The children looked on, awestruck, as sherry was drizzled, more for the spirits of the ancestors than any modern taste, and great swirls of gooseberry jelly were applied in an attitude that clearly suggested military strategy. All this excitement was accompanied by the slow ticking of the tall case clock in the hallway, a timepiece that had once belonged to a rather clock-obsessed earl who insisted it ring out "Rule Britannia" every quarter hour, a habit that had been replaced, mercifully, by a more traditional chime after it startled the cat into giving birth in a tea tray. Outside, the town's gas lamps flickered gently under their little glass bonnets, and the postman trudged up North Milk Lane with a gait that announced he was now officially full of mince pies. He delivered greetings and packages tied with brown string, often having to decipher addresses written in the curly, excited ink of unpracticed child authorship. For Granny, the cottage that smells like cinnamon, East Spurley Street, just past the Duck. As evening deepened, quiet laughter floated from the drawing room, where Uncle Brambleton had begun his annual recitation of misunderstood Shakespeare. He had strong feelings that Hamlet would have been greatly improved if it involved more tap dancing and less ghost-induced introspection. "And thus," he intoned, standing with one hand in his waistcoat and the other perched on a tea cosy, "I shuffle off this mortal boogaloo." The children politely applauded. They had long suspected that Uncle Brambleton might be made mostly of marmalade and enthusiasm anyway. Upstairs, the bedrooms were being warmed with stone hot water bottles and bed-warming pans. Lovely old brass things that resembled tools for forensic baking. The air held the scent of beeswax and lavender, with just a trace of old pine from the boxes of glass ornaments Grandpa kept wrapped in last year's newspaper stories about Queen Victoria's astonishingly slow wink. Lucy, the youngest, was tucked into her cot beside the nursery hearth, her head filled with images of puddings and buttered crumpets conducting ballroom dances under boughs of holly. Her hands, still faintly sticky with sugared chestnut, curled around a small stuffed hedgehog named Decimus. Outside, snow whispered soft lullabies across the eaves, and the leftover scent of orange peels curled around the room like a shy cat. Downstairs, Aunt Bathsheba placed the trifle into the pantry with the tenderness one usually reserves for royal christenings or ancient scrolls. It leaned slightly to one side, aware, perhaps, that gravity was only a suggestion in this household. And if you stood very still at that hour, just so, you might hear the local choir warming their voices in the chapel at the bottom of the green, where even the altos had agreed, if only for tonight, to sing harmoniously and not pick confidential feuds with the sopranos over hymnal page-turning protocol. The quiet of the house seemed to deepen, as if waiting for the next moment to arrive, a moment made of crackers, candlelight, and whispered anticipation. The sort of moment when even time pauses to sip mulled cider and exhale a contented cloud of cinnamon mist. And as the last candle was snuffed for the night, something, a sound, a stirring, perhaps just a twist in the imagination, suggested that not all the magic had yet appeared. Not quite yet, but very soon. There is a hush that settles over an old country town when church bells begin their echoing work in the early hours of Christmas Eve. Not the loud, brazen bells of urgency or royal dispatch, but the old metallic yawns of iron and patience. Our town's bell tower had 3 bells: Faith, which boomed slowly and sincerely; Grace, which tinkled a bit like a grandmother testing her teacups for cracks; and Harold, the littlest bell, whose name came from the carol confusion of a former vicar who always thought the song went, "Hark, Harold the angel sings." So it told, Hark, Grace, and Faith, in no particular hurry, stretching the bones of morning across snowy streets. The clergyman, a gentleman with eyebrows like drowsy hedgehogs, trudged in mittens through the frost to ring them by hand. This, despite having had access to a perfectly good bell-pulling boy, Joe Butterwell, who was reliable until he got distracted by anything round, shiny, or edible, which in December was often the same object. By that point in the season, the entire town had softened, under blankets of snow, yes, but also beneath waves of cinnamon, citrus, and port. Windows pulsed with buttery candlelight. Curtains stayed open just enough to let you see the warm shadow theatre of people laughing or slicing pudding or falling asleep mid-knitting, depending on their age and relationship with eggnog. In the kitchen of number 7 Chimbley Row, Mrs. Higginbotham was glazing her famous chestnut and treason pie. The name came from that time in 1807, when she accidentally served it to the town constable and his patriotic cousins, not realizing she had baked Guy Fawkes's face into the crust by over-caramelizing the eyebrows. Since then, it had become a tradition and a cautionary baking tale. Across the lane, old Mr. Maltby, retired blacksmith, amateur astronomer, and lifelong wintry romantic, had finally strung a series of precariously dangling lanterns across his porch in the shape of the Andromeda Galaxy. Only, of course, he got the chart backward. So really, he'd made half a jellyfish, but no one had the heart to tell him, mainly because Mr. Maltby was about to propose to Miss Featherwick, who'd been sneaking him extra toffee since Michaelmas. Everyone expected he'd do it on Christmas morning, probably in front of his misaligned lantern nebula and a slightly overwhelmed chicken. The town postman, meanwhile, was making his final rounds in a coat that had once belonged to a naval sergeant. It had epaulettes, which his cat found deeply offensive, and a series of unexplained brass buttons shaped like pineapples. Unlike modern postmen with their GPS and ergonomic footwear, he organized his route via vague memory and guided himself using what he grandly called the scent of greetings. This generally meant he followed whiffs of mince pie and got lost near the vicarage. Up at the schoolhouse, which had gone silent for the season, except for the gentle plotting of mice with a taste for crayon, a single wooden sled leaned against the door. It belonged to Daphne Wynchley, aged 10 3/4, who had declared loudly to anyone who would listen that this year she would sled directly into the arms of destiny, or failing that, a snowdrift. The town admired Daphne's dedication to both alliteration and public dreaming, and so it was that the world seemed sealed in a snow globe. People tiptoed rather than trudged. The usual chaos was replaced by the soft clink of glass bottles full of holiday cordial being clumsily hidden in garden sheds. Even the dogs walked slower, not for any sense of reverence, but due to the encumbering effects of knitted jumpers they hadn't voted for. Somewhere near the wintry outskirts, where the road to the next village frosted into grey uncertainty, a peculiar figure was seen trudging along, trailing something wrapped in oilskin and hope. No one knew precisely who he was, only that he had once played the saw in a band full of left-handed bassoonists, and that he returned every Christmas with a story and a ham. What tale he brought this time, and how it would be received, was something unfolding even now, one hush at a time. When the snow began to fall again that evening, thick flakes that waltzed like drowsy dancers in the twilight, it found us gathered near the ancient grandfather clock in the parlour, wrapped in blankets with mugs of something warm and dangerously soporific. Even the dog looked hypnotized, mouth slightly open, paws twitching from dreams of ill-fated squirrels. Outside, the lamplighters in their long coats and questionable mittens moved from one post to the next, as if retelling a secret in segments down the street. A ladle of golden light was poured into each glass lantern, and then another quiet corner of town blinked awake. Indoors, Aunt Lavinia had taken to reading aloud from an old woodcut illustrated almanac, which was mysteriously full of advice on things like how to remove chimney soot from brocade, or why one must not plant parsnips at midnight after Michaelmas. Which parsnips? She said ominously, tapping her nose like someone with an inside understanding of root vegetables and their dark allegiances. But tonight, with the fire crackling softly and the house smelling of toasted cinnamon and drafty memory, the conversation turned, as it often did in December, to old Tobias Weatherby. Tobias was once the town bellman, a job that combined shouting, timekeeping, and being largely ignored by everyone under 30. He was famous for ringing his handbell while announcing thrilling news like, "Mrs. Harquett's goose has escaped," or "Market apples now slightly more expensive." It was said that his voice could fracture icicles and cause infants to cry in proper key. But what made Tobias a legend, at least in our folkloric family memory, was what he did one foggy Christmas Eve 16 years before. He had, as the tale goes, declared he'd been visited in a dream by the ghost of Oliver Cromwell's horse, yes, the horse, and instructed to wrap every doorstep in the village with holly. Not just any holly, mind you. He insisted it must be respectable holly, morally upright, not the flashy sort. No one really believed him, of course. But he did it anyway. Before dawn, the entire town woke to find their stoops hedged in festive greenery, tied with twine, and labelled with cryptic messages like "Stay merry, but avoid excess," and "Duck if throwing snowballs near the smithy." Some suspected early onset senility, others blamed eggnog of military strength. Yet everyone agreed it was strangely heartwarming. "And he did it all on foot," Grandmother Beatrix would say, her eyes misting over like steamed puddings, 12 miles in galoshes and with only one working ankle. The other was mostly decorative. Old Tobias became something of a silent guardian after that. People left him jam jars and bottles of tonic on his windowsill year-round. In return, he'd sometimes leave anonymous notes tucked into shop doors. "Watch out for chimney drafts. Remember to thank the night watchman." Or simply, "Drink water sometimes." These days, Tobias mostly sat stiffly in the corner pew at church, nodding off during the longer psalms and occasionally interjecting an enthusiastic "indeed" regardless of context. Children tiptoed past him as if he might hand them unsolicited moral advice. Don't grow up too quickly, but not too slowly either, and then disappear into the mist like a sentimental reverse burglar. As our story meandered toward drowsiness, Uncle Cedric, halfway into his third brandy-enhanced tea, whispered, "They don't make eccentrics like that anymore. All ours wear branded fleeces and run online newsletters." Outside, the freshly fallen snowlight glowed bluish over the roofs, like the gentle hush after a long laugh. Church bells chimed the hour far away, blurred and beautiful, as though underwater. Even the usually sensible coat rack looked festooned in candlelit mystery, shadowed like stage props waiting patiently for their lines. A sleepy sort of reverence settled in, for stories handed down from house to house, for people who loved a little too earnestly and dressed like scarecrows on holiday, for the kinds of tales that dot small towns like sticky toffee on a glove. And just as Cousin Isolde was dozing again in her rocking chair, book open on her chest, spectacles slightly askew, the door creaked faintly in the wind, reminding us that beyond our cocoon of wool and flickering light, the rest of the world remained out there, waiting, snow-covered and wide as hope. But before we wandered too far down the winding road of recollection, there was still one surprise waiting in that sleepy town. One more knock at the door, just as the fire dimmed low. The snowfall had paused, as if the sky itself were sipping some warm cider and taking a moment to admire its own handiwork. The rooftops of the town lay heavy with the quiet weight of white, and each chimney smoked like a sleepy dragon with excellent manners. Inside the houses, the rhythm of the day had slowed to a holiday whisper, like the creak of a stair when no one is supposed to be awake, or the sigh of an armchair bracing for impact. Up at the vicarage, a place with more teacups than people and more cats than teacups, the Reverend Haddock was preparing for his annual Christmas Eve sermon. Although one might picture sermons as solemn affairs, Reverend Haddock's homilies were more like long, affectionately meandering anecdotes with surprise appearances by historical bishops, wayward shepherds, and, occasionally, ferrets. He sat at his desk, surrounded by open books and the obliging clatter of a quill, chewing absent-mindedly on the end of his spectacles. Not the lens end, thankfully, but the part designed for ear navigation. Behind him, his tabby cat, Polycarp, hovered over an inkpot with clear malice in her whiskers. "You are not St. Augustine," the Reverend murmured at her, as if that had been the accusation. "And this is not your confessions." Polycarp blinked in the unbothered manner of cats who seldom read church fathers. The vicarage was draughty, yes, and smelled distinctly of snow-damp wool and theological consideration, but it was also a kind of warm, lopsided beacon in the village. This was especially true at Christmas time, when the Reverend's home became host to a curious event known as the pre-toast. The pre-toast was something between a rehearsal dinner and an excuse to consume custard away from judgmental aunts. It took place every Christmas Eve just after dusk, when several villagers, mostly elderly, mostly with mysterious pudding-related injuries, assembled at the vicarage to prepare their toasts for the following day's Christmas celebrations. It was believed that improper toast-giving could lead to social calamity, such as being seated near the pickled onions again, or worse, being asked to sing. The Reverend, as custodian of the community's moral and syllabic health, played toastmaster and preemptive editor. He gently adjusted the pace of a farmer's anecdote, pruned the occasional over-ambitious metaphor, and once, with great delicacy, explained that comparing one's goose to the French Revolution was both impressive and unnecessary, And so, on this particular Christmas Eve, the pre-toast was in full seasonal bloom. The candles flickered politely every time the door opened, letting in another guest accompanied by a small storm cloud of snow shaken from tweed coats and the occasional pet. Mrs. Hulberd, the former schoolmistress, with a knack for weaponizing compliments, arrived with a rhubarb tart and a speech about how cranberry sauce reminded her of empire. Young Freddie Lunt brought a poem he had written to the tune of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, which required some theological detangling, as it insinuated that St. Nicholas may have moonlighted as a pirate. The room filled with the soft hum of voices bobbing along with sherry and anticipation. Mr. Duckett, seventh most senior member of the town's chess club, and famous for once forgetting his own toast mid-toast, was now armed with a stack of cue cards and a fiercely determined glint. Meanwhile, outside the vicarage window, the quiet wonder of the night returned. Snowflakes resumed their earthbound ballet, now weightless and slow, like feathers or very sleepy spirits. Somewhere in the distance, bells, soft ones, not the evangelical kind, chimed the hour in low silvery tones. The town itself seemed to sigh. Inside, Reverend Haddock rose to offer his corrections on Freddie's poem, but thought better of it. Perhaps, he decided, this was the year when even pirates deserved the benefit of the doubt. He reached for another tart instead, which Polycarp promptly tried to claim for ecclesiastical review. The evening wore on, warm and peaceably absurd. Laughter nudged the past aside just for a moment, letting the present have its say. And as the pre-toasts were toasted, and the candles offered their last acts of devotion, the vicar peered fondly through the frost-kissed window panes, wondering if, by some blessed accident, this year's Christmas morning might begin with fewer apologies than usual. Outside, the night deepened softly, like ink across parchment, and not far off, another curious corridor of holiday mischief prepared to unfold. Morning arrived draped in fog, as if the town had pulled its woolen shawl a little tighter around its shoulders and decided to mumble itself back to sleep. But of course, children, being biological opposites of foggy mornings, were wide awake and already plotting. The grown-ups, less thrilled by the notion of bundled coats and bracing air, had fortified themselves with as much tea and burnt toast as conscience allowed. Down on Porcupine Alley, a name entirely undeserved, as it hadn't hosted so much as a hedgehog in 40 years, Mr. Featherstone was attempting to persuade a batch of particularly reluctant geese into wearing festive ribbons. These, mind you, were not decorative geese. They were dinner geese. And like any self-respecting goose preparing to achieve a culinary destiny, they were suspicious of overly kind gestures. One goose in particular had already untied its bow 17 times, which may be a local record or an evolutionary trait. Not far off, the square outside the post office had been overtaken by a cheerful rabble of children tying bells to anything that would remain still longer than 16 seconds. Lampposts, milk churns, Miss Tansy's corgi. Historical records show that by Christmas Eve, there were so many tiny bells scattered about town that even the mice were jingling when they walked. This, of course, didn't stop Reverend Philpott from trying to rehearse the nativity play in the side hall of the church, a building that smelled permanently of damp hymn books and ancient biscuits. Now, the Reverend was a man of vision. His idea of setting the nativity in a Welsh coal mine had been politely vetoed, but this year he'd cunningly disguised theological confusion with poetic license. The wise men arrived by toboggan. The angel Gabriel wore cricket pads, and the baby doll in the manger had been borrowed from Mrs. Dreven's milliner shop mannequin, which made for a disconcertingly realistic infant, with a moustache penciled on for warmth. Young Thomas, reluctantly cast as the cow, had added udders fashioned from a hot water bottle and several buttons, which, he explained solemnly, was for dramatic tension. Small Maud had taken her role as the star incredibly seriously and could be found standing atop the church's coat rack, refusing to come down unless someone addressed her with celestial reverence. She had also eaten the frankincense, which no one thought to stop her from doing, since none of the adults had the faintest idea what it was for, besides sounding expensive. Meanwhile, at the bakery, Mrs. Gilderhorn was preparing her annual attempt at the 12-layer plum tower, a feat of cake engineering so structurally unsound it had once been reviewed by the Royal Society of Civil Engineers as ambitious, tragic, and edible. This year, she had incorporated a new element: sugared snowflakes made from, quite literally, frozen sugar and disappointment. Every time one cracked, she muttered something that made the parlour cat blink slowly and retreat behind the flour sacks, swishing its tail in silent judgment. It was a day of bustle and bewilderments, minor miracles and major mishaps, of errant tinsel and famous local gossip, like the scandal of the mayor's wax moustache of state accidentally melting during the punch stirring. By noon, it had floated ungracefully atop the bowl like a piece of preposterous seaweed, and several guests were sipping with extreme caution, uncertain if their next spoonful might result in an uninvited facial accessory. And all the while, the air grew colder, crisper. Chimneys began to exhale with increasing enthusiasm, little plumes of soot and cinnamon mingling like old friends in the sky. Windows flickered to life with candles and string lights, warm golden glows dancing behind lace curtains. Somewhere, a wind-up gramophone played a tune so scratchy it resembled an angry hedgehog marching through a brass section, but people hummed along anyway. Evenings in the old town had a way of slowing time, though not in a mystical sense. It was simply that every clock tower was slightly off by a different margin, and you could always find one that claimed it was earlier than you thought. Soon, the sun would dip just below the cobbled horizon, and the bells, those endlessly jingling bells, would match the rhythm of feet scurrying home, cheeks red from the cold and noses full of the scent of ginger and smouldering spruce. And somewhere between the fading light and the first glimpse of starlight on the frosty roofs, the town would settle into something close to peace, even if Miss Tansy's corgi was still ringing faintly near its tail. But that, naturally, is where things begin to get even more interesting. There was one shop in the old country town that seemed to step directly out of a fairy tale and into a chimney-smoked winter afternoon. It was not the most prosperous shop, or the most practical, or the warmest even, but it unquestionably had the finest smell, a marvellous bouquet of boiled sweets, lamp oil, and just a hint of mouse poetry, each syllable rhyming with gingerbread or sawdust. This was Mr. Coddle's Emporium, a place of such confusing variety that local children suspected Mr. Coddle didn't purchase inventory, but instead allowed objects to pop into existence by sheer force of whimsy. On one creaky shelf sat a box of Victorian buttons labelled for trousers of tragedy. Next to it, 3 clock faces with no hands and 1 sock, definitely haunted. Meanwhile, at the very bottom, leaning against an antique pineapple Cora, was the shop's best-kept secret, an army of forgotten tin soldiers fond of quoting Shakespeare in Polish. And then, of course, there was Mr. Coddle himself, An elderly man with eyebrows like startled cats and spectacles so thick he could probably read Latin from Mars. He wore waistcoats that looked as though they had once been curtains in a boudoir, possibly haunted by a ghost who spoke only in floral embroidery. On Christmas Eve, Mr. Coddle would stay open just a touch later than strictly allowed, because, as he put it, the magic seems to bloom a bit more slowly this time of year, like a plum pudding reluctant to explode. And that night, our young narrator, swaddled in a scarf long enough to border Belgium, was sent on an errand, a last-minute dash for candied cloves and possibly toothbrush chalk, depending on the shop's reliability. Stepping inside, the door let out a sigh sound, not a squeak, and the floorboards responded with a lullaby creak that seemed to say, "Welcome, we've missed your wait." A spiral of warm, sugar-laced air curled around one's ankles. Bells tinkled somewhere, not from the door, but from a brass kangaroo hanging beside a map of the Ottoman Empire. Mr. Coddle appeared from behind a curtain made entirely of broken violin bows and said, "Ah, a customer of noble lineage, I can tell by your galoshes, or possibly by the angle of your eyebrows. In any case, welcome." The child mentioned the candied cloves. Mr. Coddle frowned philosophically, as if considering whether cloves were real, or just very short pine cones in disguise. He vanished behind a stack of encyclopedias about ancient sandwich techniques and re-emerged triumphantly, holding a small tin decorated with sea serpents playing cricket. As the clove transaction concluded, the bell above the door chirped again. In walked old Miss Lathbury, cloaked in tartan from throat to toe, holding a gramophone horn like a war trumpet. The child quickly stepped aside, knowing well that Miss Lathbury did not shop so much as declare war upon dithering. "Mr. Coddle," she barked, "have you any sympathy cards written in medieval Latin? I might have one written in early Middle English, apologizing for stealing a pig," he shrugged. "That'll do." This was followed by vigorous rumbling and a minor avalanche of old encyclopedias. Mr. Coddle gave Miss Lathbury her pig apology card and turned back to the child. "You know," he said with a wistful glance toward a flaking globe of Neptune above the counter, "Christmas always reminds me of the time I swapped a fruitcake for a Roman denarius and terribly insulted an archaeologist." He paused. Fruitcakes are quite diplomatic, but only in moderate climates. The child offered a solemn nod, as if to say, "A fair point, sir." With the shopping complete, and Mr. Coddle now analysing a Victorian child's boot for signs of emotional distress, it was time to head back to the cold. The child waved a mitten, and was waved back at by what might have been an actual mitten with feelings. Outside, night had settled in like a soft sneeze between the rooftops. Windows glowed with firelight and quiet Christmases unfurled behind every curtain. The wind, now gentle, seemed to approve of the child's scarf, nudging it like a sleepy cat. And the narrator walked home, tin of Christmas cloves swaying in the pocket, sweet, spicy, and possibly magical, depending on how long they'd been in that sea serpent tin. Sleepy footsteps scrunched along the snowy path, past frozen hedges and warmly whistling chimneys. Ahead lay one final evening and one last steaming pudding. But for now, just the journey home, and stars above half wrapped, like Victorian secrets too sleepy to shine properly. Outside, the snow had stopped its gentle scribbling across the windows, leaving soft heaps on the stone sills like forgotten dollops of sugar icing. The hearth was now a quiet glow, no longer fiery, but warm enough to toast a final slipper sole or hold a sleepy cat in the orange halo of its fading light. The little town of Kipping-on-Way slept under woolen clouds, curled up in a hush that only Christmas night could summon. Inside the parlour, where the last embers gave the walls a lazy golden hue, and the scent of roasted chestnut still lingered in the drapery. Old Grandfather Thistlewick was spiralling through the closing stanza of his favourite story. It was, admittedly, a tale he had told many times before, though he claimed the story rewrote itself with every telling, like a polite ghost adjusting its hat. And so, he declared, with only mild theatrical resistance from the armchair upholstery, young Horace finally did apologise to the lamplighter after accidentally hurling the figgy pudding into his bucket, an accident, of course, made entirely out of mischief and wind. The children, assembled like drowsy ducklings on the rug, laughed softly, not at the joke so much as at the memory of Horace, somewhere inexplicably related to all of them, clinging to the mythic status of the boy who flung dessert with suspicious accuracy. Mr. Featherwick, the librarian, who had dropped by to deliver a copy of Ye Old Practical Almanac of Common Candle Extinguishment, was now quietly dozing in a corner, the book unopened on his belly, rising and falling like some mildly enchanted tome. It had been a long evening of darning socks, nibbling sugar mice, and arguing cheerfully about whether the snowman with the carrot pipe looked more like Queen Victoria or someone else entirely. It was eventually decided he looked like both, depending on the angle and the wind. As midnight drifted closer, the bells of St. Winifred's gave a gentle jingle-jangle, like distant laughter in the rafters of the sky. Not the official bongs, mind you. Those were reserved for dramatic declarations, just the subtle practice chimes, rung by the junior bell ringer, who played them like a warm-up sketch on the world's sleepiest xylophone. Down on the high street, shop windows sat, snowblind in silence. The butcher's festive garland had finally lost its battle with gravity, leaving a string of limp cranberries swinging like Victorian jewellery. And nobody, not even the night constable affectionately known as Sergeant Snore, was interested in being upright. His lantern had gone dim sometime around the second round of bread pudding. Back in the parlour, young Imogen, all ribbon and elbow, whispered, "Do you think the goose laid an egg before we ate it?" and promptly fell asleep before anyone could answer. Which was just as well, because Grandfather's explanation might have involved a highly unnecessary tangent about the poultry economy of 1834, and so the room breathed in unison, the way only places full of sleeping people can. Every stocking had sagged a little with the weight of peppermint sugar and quiet joy. Every candle had gone politely out, as though bowing after a very good performance. Even the clock ticked more slowly now, meandering through its minutes as though browsing. Outside, the moon gifted silver to every rooftop, ribboned each branch with twinkle, and wrapped the old town in a peace too deep for marketing. Kipping-on-Way, in the full embrace of its most enchanted slumber, nestled into the history books without fuss. Its peculiar traditions, its lopsided carolers, its peculiar love of decorative sweet, all filed away under affectionately odd. And isn't that the best kind of history, really? So we leave them here, tucked into their time and place. The boots by the door await tomorrow's snow. The biscuit tin is closed, but not quite latched. And perhaps, just perhaps, if you slip into dreams lightly enough, you might find yourself there too, walking past those crooked cottages, a snowflake on your glove, and someone handing you a hot toddy without asking your name. Sleep well, clever traveller. History, after all, is just memory with excellent lighting.